You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Daly and Kevin Laramie.
Hello and welcome to episode 24 of Scuderia Formula One, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly and I'm joined tonight by Kevin Laramie to wrap up the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, celebrate a new world champion, and, if you can finally believe it, wrap up this season. This world records long season is actually over. And Kevin, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing pretty good, Mark. 21 races this year, and it seems like the last few races went by like it was just 2 weeks, but to get there, yeah, we had some lulls during the season.
Absolutely. And I think also too that it's amazing that I think ever since the US Grand Prix, what was about a month ago, the last 4 races have been an absolute blur. Mexico, USA, Brazil, and now Abu Dhabi to wrap it up. I'm just sitting here right now thinking, where did it all go that last, not quite quarter of the season, but pretty close to it? And it was an exciting finish to the year. Of course, when you look at the record book a couple of years from now, and you see that 19 out of the 21 races were won by the dominant Mercedes team, who of course won the Constructors' Championship for a third year running. But I guess it's a little bit misleading to think that there was no excitement in it. Of course, it only really went down between Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg yet again for the World Championship. But those last, I don't know, was it 15 laps or whatever it was in the race, were actually very, very exciting. But before we get to that, of course, going into the weekend, Lewis Hamilton said that his whole focus was on getting the pole position and then just taking it from there and seeing what he could do in the race and hope that good fortune would go his way and maybe he get a little bit of luck. Maybe Nico would finish off of the podium. He would get the win and somehow he would manage to win his 4th world title. It didn't actually work that way, but it was, I guess, pretty much what you could expect as we've seen for the last several races. Again, it was a Mercedes lockout on the front row, Lewis with the pole and Nico Rosberg just there or thereabouts in second position. And then your usual suspects of Red Bulls and Ferraris. And I guess if you're Nico Rosberg, I guess he was fairly relieved to see Max Verstappen starting in 6th position with a nice Ferrari buffer between them with Kimi Räikkönen, who I guess would have qualified 4th. So he had a bit of a buffer between the two of them. So that was a good way to start.
You would have thought. Yeah, you would have thought, Mark, but no, exactly. Max Verstappen eventually actually was what Nico feared the most, and he had to get over him, overtake him, and he did it, and he was clean, and he didn't go off track, and Nico Rosberg was able to keep his car away from any damage with Verstappen. But yeah, what he feared, even though he might have been relieved that he was 6th, actually happened during the race, though.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because Verstappen, he actually ended up at the back of the pack before they were even 2 corners into the race, because when they went into turn 1, he actually bumped into Nico Hülkenberg, who was in 7th on the grid, who qualified 7th, and he spun out. Unfortunately, neither car had any damage, but Max ended up right at the back of the pack, which made for a bit of an exciting time because contrary to almost everybody else, especially the front runners at any rate, Max had opted for the super soft tires. Everybody else was on the ultra softs, and it was quite enjoyable watching him do what Max does best, kind of carving his way through the pack. And those ultra soft tires didn't really last very long. Hamilton and Rosberg came in on lap 10 and 11, which was almost an identical situation because Lewis came in first, changed his tires, and then got held up a little bit because one of the Ferraris came into the pit. Fast forward a lap, Nico comes in for his tire change, and almost the identical thing happens again too. So that little advantage that he had of a second or two while Lewis was waiting for the Ferrari to pass and get their tires changed. I can't remember which one, if it was Vettel or Räikkönen who came in first. It's a little bit irrelevant, but anyways, it was kind of ironic that it actually worked out that way. But by that point, Verstappen had worked his way all the way back up, and Nico Rosberg came out exactly where he didn't want to be, in third position behind Max Verstappen, with Lewis. Well, he wasn't really flying away from them, but again, Abu Dhabi is one of those places you would think that there'd be plenty of opportunities to overtake, but it isn't really a track that sees a lot of overtaking during the race. So
only beginning,
yeah,
basically, only after the first turn. But then if you miss your chance there, you're stuck behind for the rest of the lap. And that's what he was saying after the race. We'll get there soon. But he was saying, he's holding me back, but he's doing fine in the first part. So I can't really do anything about it.
Which was fascinating, too, because when I guess Nico had been stuck behind Max for, I can't even count how many laps it was, but he was behind him for quite a while. And all of a sudden he gets a bit of a hurry up message over the race radio telling him to get up, pick up the pace, get in front of Verstappen. And so he did. He pulled him in, and they came to that very tight series of a left and right corner or turns at the end of turn 8, and Nico pulled him in at the end of that very long straightaway and really came from a long way back to pass him. And Max ran a little bit wide. I guess Nico pushed him a little bit as they went into the corner and forced him out onto the outside of the turn. But Max came back across, and they came oh so close to touching. But Nico, obviously having a little bit more momentum through those corners, just managed to make the move stick as they got out of that second left-hander, and just under the power, under acceleration, got past Verstappen. And then that's how it stayed for a little while, because Verstappen, like I said, he started on the super soft tires, which was interesting too, because what they were saying, what Crofty was saying on the Sky Sports broadcast, where the super softs were basically only supposed to last about the same as the ultra soft tires. But Verstappen, I think he made them last for about 24 laps. And that's one thing that we've seen a couple of times this year, that Max has been able to make his tires last longer than what a lot of people have been able, or what a lot of people have expected. And he opted for a one-stop strategy where everybody else opted for a two-stopper. And it really made things interesting. But anyways, before he went in for his tire stop, it was Hamilton, Rosberg, and Verstappen. And then eventually, later in the race, Sebastian Vettel, who also had a bit of a different tire strategy, he came out and he opted for the super softs in his last stint. So he went ultra soft, and then super soft, and he had tons of pace and eventually clawed his way up to third. But there's a little bit of a story behind that. It wasn't that he only had pace. There were a couple other things involved. Why don't you take it from there, Kevin?
Well, it's the perception of pace that Vettel have. And I will explain the image at the end when we saw all those cars close to it, heading to the finish line. That was quite an image that we haven't seen in a while. But let's go back to Hamilton. All right. Before we take aside if it was it right, was it wrong, I'll just lay the groundworks a little bit, Mike. In your position, Hamilton, you're first, but the goal is not to win the race, it's to win the championship. What can you do? The guy behind you win the championship if the status quo stays the same. The ideal thing that you could do, but is frowned upon, if not illegal, is to ram him off the race and he doesn't finish and you do, and you win the race and you win the championship. But you can't do that. What's the closest thing that kind of fits into the legal book of F1? Well, if I put into traffic, if we're battling, or if there's a race incident and he doesn't finish the race, then Lewis wins the championship. That's kind of the idea behind it. That's kind of leave it up to chance. Leave it up to what if. So if I go slower and he has to go slower, he's not going to be able to overtake me because I'll keep the right pace in the first section, then go slower at the second and third, and do this for a few laps and get everything close together. And who knows, maybe a Vettel behind it will see an opportunity and, oh, what can happen? Boom, you never know. That's kind of the only thing he could do.
Yeah, and that's so very, very true. That's right, because all Nico had to do is, if Lewis won that race, was stay in at least third position. Second, obviously, would have been a little bit better, but third is what he needed. And so, of course, every time Lewis looked in his rearview mirrors, there was Nico Rosberg just a couple of seconds behind him, just doing what he's done for the previous 3 races, just there, close but not close enough, and maybe not pushing his car quite as hard, or maybe pushing it just as hard as he needed to. And you're right, that's the only thing that Hamilton could do, was maybe artificially influence the race by slowing down the pace. And this is something that we saw only a couple of races ago in Mexico. And that time it was the Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel that was caught between Max Verstappen and Daniel Ricciardo. And Max's tires weren't really lasting all that well that time. Vettel was pushing to try and get past Max. And in the meantime, Danny Ricciardo, who was on fresher rubber, was pulling in Vettel. And so they were trying to set up that and try and launch Ricciardo past Vettel, and then probably also at some point Verstappen would have let his teammate past. Of course, that didn't happen, and Vettel was on the radio, and he was really, really ticked off. And of course, that led to that famous incident where he told Charlie Whiting, the race director, to go and do all number of unpleasant things to himself. But it's a tactic that we do see, and that's
and it's leveling the playing field, Mike. Right? It's like becoming a pace car. You just pull everybody closer together, and that doing so, you leave it up to others to do not your dirty work, but kind of.
That's right. And it was interesting too, because Lewis had got a couple of messages from the pit wall, and that came after Nico was complaining that he wasn't going fast enough, just like, what was that, in China 2014 or 2015? That was a similar situation that time when Lewis was in front of Nico, and then Vettel was coming up behind him, and Nico was on the radio complaining that Lewis was going way too slow. Anyways, it was the same thing this time. And it was interesting because apparently Mercedes have a certain set of radio protocols that the only people that speak to them are their race engineers from the pit wall, and that's it. And if they really need to escalate the message, the next person will be Paddy Lowe. And of course, a couple of laps later, Paddy gets on to the radio telling Lewis to hurry up, that he's in danger of throwing the race away, because even though he had slowed them down, Vettel did have plenty of speed. He had the fresher tires out of everybody, and those super softs were working quite well for him. So who knows, if he'd gotten past Rosberg, would he have been able to pass Hamilton? I don't think so. I think what would have happened at that point was that if Vettel had gotten past Rosberg, I think we would have seen Lewis all of a sudden magically find loads more pace and then disappear, and then hope that maybe he'd backed his teammate up far enough that perhaps he would come under threat from Max Verstappen and then maybe drop down from 3rd to 4th. And then, of course, we got a complete different scenario. But all the controversy came from when Paddy Lowe got on the radio. And I think a lot of people were thinking at that point, well, what happens next? Are we going to hear Toto on the radio? Are we going to hear Toto and Nicky on the radio telling Lewis to hurry up, or what's going to happen? So that's where the controversy was, and that's what they talked about after the race. But like you say, he didn't do anything illegal. He didn't pull like a Senna and Prost at Suzuka in, what was that, 1988 or 1989. He didn't do the Schumacher chop on Damon Hill at Adelaide in 1994, or like he did on Jacques Villeneuve. So it wasn't something blatant or as silly as the Senna and Prost thing, where neither of them refused to budge an inch and then ended up taking each other out of the race. This was a bit of a gray area, like we were saying, and he disobeyed not just one, but many team orders to speed up and get going. And even at one point, he almost said a little bit petulantly, well, I'm not worried about winning the race. I'm more concerned about winning the world championship. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but you could obviously tell where his priorities were. So that was interesting. But yeah, it's a bit of a gray area. I mean, it's not 100% fair, like you say, but he didn't do anything illegal. So it'll be a controversial moment, and I'm sure one that people will talk about for a long, long time to come.
And in a way, it kind of takes a little bit, not out of the championship, but we're not talking about Nico Rosberg winning the championship off the top of the show because, well, a little bit because of Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, absolutely. But now what happens? Because there's been lots of talk in the last 24 hours since the checkered flag, since the fireworks and champagne and the parties and the celebrations and all the donuts by multiple drivers around the circuits. Because let's face it, they don't care if they break the car now. These cars are going to get cleaned up and polished and go in a museum somewhere. Anyways,
exactly, especially this year.
Exactly. I mean, next year, the brand new regulations come into effect. So these are literally museum pieces. I think they're doing some tire testing, but nothing that requires any serious race mileage or anything like that. But it was suggested, and I saw in multiple articles, especially those in the UK. And I thought these were quite sensationalist because there were these internal rules that Mercedes put down after the multiple incidents that we've seen between Rosberg and Hamilton over the last couple of years. Spa was one, US Grand Prix, Spain this year, Austria this year. So they do have rules, and they did bring in something that they can fine or suspend one of the drivers should it come to that. And the suggestions that I saw that Lewis, by disobeying team orders, has literally put his $30 million or 30 million pound, whatever it is, contract at risk by doing that. And I was thinking, well, come on, seriously, do you think that Mercedes is actually going to find or suspend or fire Lewis Hamilton for what he did at Abu Dhabi? Mercedes want to win. And if you have the best car in Formula One, and you have all the money in the world, you want to have the best driver driving your car. And that guy is Lewis Hamilton. And
not just that, Mark. Sorry to interrupt. You want the guy who wants to win. And what does it say about Lewis Hamilton that he's willing to go this far to win? Maybe not to ram a guy off the track, which you don't want, but to go the furthest to that line as you can proves a willingness to win that you kind of need to win 3 world championships in a career and a 4th like he wants to do.
And that's a very good question, because coming into the year, there was a lot of discussion and debate about Lewis Hamilton being the first British driver to win 3 world championships. And the big question was, coming into 2016, was the hunger still there? Was the desire still there for Lewis Hamilton to go on and win a 4th world title? Obviously, we've seen other guys win that many, like Sebastian Vettel, Michael Schumacher, Fangio, but it's in a very elite club. But after winning 3 and obviously having more money than he'll ever be able to spend his entire lifetime and all the fame and all those things that come along with it, was he still motivated to get into the car and be the best? And I think that it's been proven in the last couple of weeks, probably since Brazil, if not before, probably actually since Malaysia, since his engine let go on him. I think that was a wake-up call for Lewis. And I think that he responded well because, I mean, he dominated the last 4 races with the poles, with the wins and everything. And I think that it was a bit of a wake-up call to him. And I think that it did, in fact, prove to him that, yes, he is still hungry for a 4th world championship, and he's got the desire. And if he's got the car to do it, he can go out and do it. And he basically said as much, that if Mercedes can give him that car, and this was, I think, a bit of a veiled hint. Well, actually, it wasn't a veiled sort of hint. It was actually quite blatant. But they said if they can give him a reliable car like Nico had this year, he said it'd be no problem to go and win the championship.
And he's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
If it wasn't for the engine problem this year, Lewis Hamilton would be the world championship today, Mark. It's that simple. 10 wins, and that would be around 12 if you didn't have those engine problems, because every single time this season, or maybe not every single time, don't take my word for it, but more than not, when Lewis and Nico have cars that don't break against each other and don't take each other out, Lewis usually is in front of Nico. Yes, Nico had 7 in a row last year and this year. But Hamilton this year, 10. Nico, 9 wins. And yes, Nico was consistent and he finished second when he had to and all that thing. But Lewis showed that he could win. And if he had those points with the trouble engine and the relegation and starting from further back and having the complication and having to save his engine sometimes, it would be different. But it is what it is. And it's not what ifs. It is a world championship. And Nico Rosberg is the world champion in 2016.
That's very true. And I think that Nico was obviously the more, well, I would say consistent of the 2 drivers, but he got the job done when he needed to get it done. And they both had problems, mechanical problems in Russia. and they both managed to nurse the car home. But Nico obviously didn't have the spectacular failures that Hamilton had. And I just was thinking as you were talking there that when they went into the summer break, how things had looked like they were turned and had gone the opposite way. And it looked like perhaps it was starting to be Lewis that was going to be the favorite. And then they come back from that 3-week break and they go to Spa, and Hamilton incurs that big, 50-place grid penalty or whatever it was for basically changing everything on his engine. So he had basically a fresh batch to work with for the rest of the season. I thought, well, that seems like a heck of a gamble, but it worked out for them because remember, we saw Lewis all the way at the back of the grid, and then just everything that played out in that race, that even though Rosberg won, where did Hamilton come? He was like third that race or something. So it worked out very, very well for him. And then Nico won the next several races. So he kind of started both segments to the year very quickly because he won 4 off of the bat at the start of the year, and then he won, 4 off of the bat, or 3 at least, in the second half of the season, and then Hamilton slowly came back. And for me, the real game changer was Malaysia when Hamilton had the engine failure there, because I think at that point, obviously, everything changed. And I think that Rosberg's game plan changed, that he wasn't necessarily going out to win every race. He could just maybe sit there and manage it a little bit more, because at that point, just with the number of races running out, it was obviously that Hamilton had to push more. And Nico was obviously, I think he must realize that head to head over the space of one lap or a race, that Hamilton is the faster driver. There's no question about that. So where do you think you're going to try and find your advantage, on the track, or are you going to try and play the long game and just try and be maybe a little bit more cerebral about it? Just realize, well, I can't beat the guy head to head because he's always going to be a little bit harder or a little bit faster. And the times when we have come together, then we actually really have come together, ended up in the gravel, on the grass, whatever it might be. Maybe I got to take a bit of a different approach to this.
And the other side of the equation, like you mentioned, if Lewis Hamilton had all those engine problems and Nico didn't, technically they started with the same equipment. Maybe Nico does something right that Lewis doesn't. Maybe Nico saves his engine a little bit better. Maybe Nico is able to not push the car as much, but over the long run, it pays more dividends. Maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, exactly. And also the championship is decided obviously over the course of 21 races. And to think that it came down to the difference of, 5 points in the end? Nico had 385 and Lewis had 380. I mean, that is impressive.
Something I don't have it in front of me, but
something like that. But it's amazing to think that over all the thousands, tens of thousands of kilometers driven and flown, and all the thousands and thousands of hours put into these cars, and all the testing, practice, design, whatever it is, it comes down to that. But when you think over the last couple of years, that the first time that the championship was decided between these two at Abu Dhabi 2 years ago in 2014, it was Nico Rosberg who was the one that was the one that had the reliability issues when his ERS malfunctioned on him and he dropped all the way back to 14th position. He really struggled around, and it was Lewis that won at that time. And then last year, Nico also had some problems. I remember at Monza, he had a very spectacular engine failure that was very similar to what Hamilton had. So Nico has had some problems over the years as well. So it's just the cycle of Formula One. Sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't, but it is a very, very difficult sport to win in. And I know some of these guys like Hamilton and some of the teams like Mercedes and Ferrari, when they are dominant in the Schumacher years, they make it look easy, but it is a very difficult sport to win. So all credit to Nico, all credit to Mercedes. I mean, what they have done the last 3 years especially is nothing short of awesome. It's very, very impressive what they've done.
Yes, even though it might not be the best for the quote-unquote spectacle, for the entertainment purposes, when you look at it on paper, 19 wins out of 21 races, and the one that didn't win is because they took him out. So, or got unlucky with Verstappen winning it. So, no, it is impressive. It is amazing. But I'm looking forward to 2017 to have what everybody's expecting now. Red Bull having a great development, maybe Mercedes close to it too. So maybe it's a 4-car championship next year. We'll see.
Yeah, it's going to be a complete unknown until they actually get to Melbourne in the middle of May. I was going to say the middle of May, middle of March, excuse me. And we actually see them out there in qualifying during the race and see them all head to head, because the winter testing can be a little bit misleading because they're obviously not racing against each other. But it will be fascinating to see who gets the interpretation of the new rules correct. Are we going to see somebody surprised like Braun GP did in 2009? Or is it going to be the same as it was the last couple of years, where Mercedes is just that 1 or 2 steps ahead of everybody else and is going to completely dominate? And of course, you're completely correct that it was all Mercedes again this year, what with 19 out of 21 races, the other 2 picked up by the Red Bull drivers. But in general, I don't think that this is a season that Red Bull should be too disappointed about. Obviously, they would have wanted to win a lot more than 2 races, but they were much better than Ferrari. Of course, on their day.
And they progressed, Mike. Sorry to
that's
interrupt
okay.
once again. but they progressed during the season. They're better off now than they were at the beginning of the season. Think about it. Kvyat was their second driver, and Verstappen finished 5th in the Drivers' Championship, having missed a few races because he was with Toro Rosso, a far lesser car. So look at the whole season for Red Bull. They have a star in the making who maybe next year can have a shot of winning a world championship at 19 years old. There's a lot of things that can happen with Red Bull, and Verstappen is that breath of fresh air that nobody expected to happen this season. And look at the progress that Red Bull have made since Verstappen has been the second driver, and that lit a fire under Ricciardo's behind. So you do have that dynamic heading to a big year for next year for the entire Red Bull family. So it will be very fascinating to see how it unfolds, but they progressed a lot in 2016.
Oh, definitely. It's flipped 180 degrees for them. When you look at this time last year, they were talking about pulling out of Formula One. They were bickering openly with Renault about the quality of the engine, that it just didn't have enough speed, didn't have enough power, and all these things. And then they decide that they are going to take their engines, because they were offered some other deals that weren't really all that great, probably like a year-old specification Ferrari engine or something like that. So obviously that wouldn't be the greatest option for them. But they, for me, were the big surprise out of, say, the big 3 teams. And they obviously overstepped Ferrari, who were quite disappointing this year, didn't win a single race. But I think for me also, what was very surprising in the Constructors' Championship was to see Force India in 4th place. I wouldn't say miles ahead of Williams Mercedes, but they've ended up with 173 points in the Constructors compared to 138 for Williams. So they managed to get it done. So that was quite good to see. And then, of course, obviously Hülkenberg is off to Renault for next year, and Esteban Ocon is going to end up driving for Mercedes along Checo Perez. So we'll see what they're doing. And they actually stopped development of this car quite early in the season to focus on 2017. So Force India is going to be a very interesting team to watch next year. Obviously, I don't think we're going to see them challenging for race wins.
Well, you never know, but no, because it changes so much. But the fact that they have an engine from a different era or the year before, but that is reliable, that has so you can build around it. You can actually, more about the engine. So it's like really squeezing the most amount of juice possible out of the fruit.
Yep.
And they're able to get good results with it. And that reliability at the end of the season helped them to overcome Williams. Williams struggled this season, and not necessarily compared to McLaren, but did not necessarily perform to expectation how they were going into 2016. Let's just put it that way. With the result they had last year, battling for maybe even close to being a Red Bull or Ferrari car. So you have the season, it's a step back for Williams, but for Force India, their progress slowly, but the consistency of their driver Their driver were able to get the most out of the cars, and that would mix with the data that they know about the engine and the specs, and able to get the most amount of the input that you can put on that engine. They got good results out of it, and it's well deserved that fourth place in the constructor
Yeah,
championship.
and it's interesting, of course, to see that the top 5 teams in the constructors, 3 of them have Mercedes engines. Obviously, the Mercedes Works team, Force India, and Williams. And just like you were saying about Williams, for me, they were a disappointment because over the last couple of years, it looked like, exactly like you were saying, it looked like they were edging a little bit closer to the Red Bulls and the Ferrari. And then this year, they just weren't able to maintain that momentum going forward. And obviously for them, that's a disappointment to end up 5th in the Constructors Championship. But hey, they got all winter, not all weekend, I was going to say. That would be a little bit too short to turn it around for 2017, but they do.
But we'll have time, Mark, to review during the off season some of the disappointment, like Haas and stuff like that they didn't pan out the way it started, like in Melbourne and stuff. But there's a lot of those stories to come. But it is interesting to see where this championship finishes. And now, like, everybody want to quickly turn the page to 2016 because it's such a short time to bring, quote unquote, maybe a new era in Formula One.
Yeah, exactly. And just to maybe just dial it back just for one extra second on the Williams discussion. And of course, next year, we're going to see 18-year-old Lance Stroll from Montreal, your hometown, coming in to drive for Williams. So is he going to be that spark for Williams? Can he provide that sort of Max Verstappen type energy into the team? We'll wait and see.
Oh, not just that. Williams, in the history of Formula One, whenever there are big change, Williams is one of the teams that usually takes advantage of it. We'll see if this happens once again.
Absolutely. It's going to be a fascinating off season, and I can't wait for 2017. So how many days? have you put the countdown clock on yet?
Not yet, but
it's coming soon. Well, soon enough. I'm sure it always seems to go pretty quickly. As much as I lament the end of the season, it always comes quick before you really even realize, and before you know, we'll be winding up to next year. But I think that's pretty much all we got for this week, isn't it?
Yeah, but just I don't want to be a Debbie Downer because if people don't know, you covered the Vancouver Whitecaps as well, and I covered the Montreal Impact. So the last month, I've been quite busy on my side with the Montreal Impact because we're running the Major League Soccer playoff, playing tomorrow night or tonight or last night, whenever you're listening to this, and maybe going to the MLS Cup final, or we'll see. But I'm probably going to attend the MLS Cup final anyway. So the last few weeks and then the next week and a half coming are quite busy as well, planning and looking at everything. So it's been quite a blur, F1. Just like an F1.
Well, ever since the Vancouver Whitecaps were knocked out of the playoff race, and this is probably going back, it was about 5 or 6 weeks before Halloween. It's been quite a while. So to be quite honest, I've invested a lot of the time that I spend covering the Whitecaps to doing a lot of the things that I've neglected doing for this show. So I've spent a lot of extra time investing some energy into trying to beef up our social media channels on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. So I've been growing those steadily. And I was kind of thinking the other day, because my other show, From the Back Line, which is a Whitecaps focused podcast, we had one of the local broadcasters on to help wrap up and just talk about the season, maybe look ahead to 2017. And we were just talking off air before it even recording the show, just how long it had been since we were actually seriously covering them. So I know what it's like when you're trying to do both, or maybe even the soccer, the Formula One, and the other things. And I know you cover a lot more than I do. Things become a real blur really quickly.
Oh yeah, sometimes like everything creeps up on you. Like, oh, it's already here. Already? Oh wow. So Wednesday morning, traveling to Toronto for the game. And we'll see if I'm traveling to Toronto the week after or if I'm traveling to Seattle.
Well, one's obviously a little bit closer than the other, so I'm sure it'll be exciting whatever happens.
One, like, that's the thing, logistically speaking, one's a lot easier, but it won't have the same feel, same appeal, and same opportunities for me. And if you go to Montreal going into the final, Well, it's going to Seattle, and it's quite far away. For you, it might not be seem
It's
too
only
far.
2 hours down the road, so not too bad at all.
Me, it's about a 6-hour flight. So
Yeah, a little bit of a difference, but it's all good. And it's a little bit strange to think that everything's wrapping up, but we will be back periodically over the winter months we'll wrap up the season at some point and discuss any of the latest news as it comes out. And also, I think after this first season, I'm starting to get a little bit of a finger on the pulse to what we can do to maybe develop or maybe streamline, maybe tweak the show a little bit for next year. So plenty of good things coming. So Kevin, thank you very much for sitting here all year and contributing. It's been a blast. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody that's been downloading the show. Don't go away. Like I said, we're not going anywhere. So, but at least for this week, for now, that's all we have. And before we go, Kevin, could you just remind everybody where they can find you online and what else we've got going on?
you can follow me on Twitter at KevLarme, and you can follow my Facebook page, facebook.com/sportspodcasting network, for live videos whenever I'm covering an event. And that's mostly soccer, but you will have over the next few months, next year, the Grand Prix, the Formula E. You will have the behind-the-scene look on my Facebook page with the Facebook Live capabilities. So facebook.com/sportspodcasting.
Very cool. Thank you, Kevin. And of course, you can follow this show on Twitter at Scuderia F1. Sorry, at Scuderia F1 Pod on Twitter. I'll get that right eventually. And we also have a Facebook page. So head on over to Facebook and like our page, and that's Scuderia F1 Pod. And that's it. That's a wrap. That's all we have for this week. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.